A legal showdown over speech and conscience. What should you do when you may have to challenge the power of government to compel what faith-based organizations must say? At stake is free speech, religious liberty, and who sets the limits? Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of guests for today. First, we have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We also have Dr. Amilcar Groeschel, a pastor, an attorney, a professor of philosophy, theology, and law at Washington Adventist University. We also have with us Viola Weiss, who's one of the Indiana Conference Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director. And we have Dr. Wilmer Leon, nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. Gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our show. You know, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton was asked why the framers had omitted the word God from the document. His reply, "We forgot." Yet, when the first Congress assembled in 1790, among its first acts were select a chaplain and to ask President George Washington to declare a day of Thanksgiving. You know, Thomas Jefferson said that he would want, even on his gravestone, his primary accomplishments, which he listed as drafting the Declaration of Independence, founding the University of Virginia, and writing the Virginia Statute for religious freedom, which was enacted in 1786. You know, when we take a look at some of the things that are going on in this area regarding the founding fathers, you know, Dr. Leon, it almost seems as though we're in a situation where we sometimes forget where this all began, how it came together, how it got shaped. People want to call it a Christian nation. We have the framers saying, I actually forgot. We have chaplains that are created even before the Constitution exists. I understand the confusion, but what do you think the founding fathers were really trying to get at in terms of finding maybe the right situation where you didn't push too hard into religion, but also being clear it's still a foundation of who many of us are?
Well, I think the big debate centered around whether or not there would be a national religion or not. And having just fought a Revolutionary War, where one of the big conflicts was the crown trying to impose a religion on the colonists, they saw this as being such a big point of contention. We just fought a Revolutionary War to get away from this. We're not going to create a document or create a structure of government that puts us right back potentially in the same mix that we just got out of. So that's why they had no problem with freedom of thought. The issue was practice. And I think it's also important to look at how the First Amendment was written, because the First Amendment is considered a negative right because it is a prohibition against government action. And they saw that as being the broader protection against imposition by the government. So that's why you have it written the way that it is.
This entire discussion, quote unquote, that we have today of church-state relations and religious freedom, it's important. It's also in a different context. I think it's important to note. But those contexts are similar enough if we know the context to work. So I think one part is religious liberty was established in the U.S. not because all the people in the colonies decided, you know what, everyone is a beautiful butterfly and deserves their own thing, and we respect all religions. There was none of that. Those religious traditions wanted to be the dominant religious tradition in America, and they tried. and they kept fighting and fighting and fighting, and nothing could get done. Right? The act of religious toleration in Maryland is because Catholics and Protestants kept killing each other, and they didn't think the colony would last. So the religious liberty was Protestants and Catholics can get together, and also if you say something against Mary, the Mother of God, will hang you in the square. It's not the same type of act of toleration that we think of, but it also means that contention doesn't overrule this. The fact that people don't agree, that actually is the point of religious liberty. And I think the second important point that Dr. Leon alluded to there, technically, so this has changed over the course of American history, right? Both in the legal understanding of this by the Supreme Court, but the consistent meaning seems to be, especially in cases involving the Latter-day Saints, religious liberty means you can believe whatever you want religiously, doctrinally, theologically. You cannot do whatever you want based on those beliefs. And I think an understanding of that combined with contention and fighting is built into this. Disagreements are built in. That's actually the purpose, so that people can get along in a way that allows us to function as a free society. I think if we would maybe focus on that a little more than I'm not getting my way. No, everyone's not going to get their way. This is how we balance rights. We maybe be on better footing today when we talk about these issues.
You know, Amilcar, when you think about this concept of this being kind of like a negative right, but also the idea that just because you have a religious belief, I don't get to practice any way I feel. And the idea of the inherent tension that exists in this proclamation, I think is something that was obviously intentional, but we live in a society where tension seems to make people upset, when tension seemed to be the actual intent of what the framers really wanted to do. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Exactly, because it alludes to human nature. We will disagree eventually. And I really believe that one of the most important things to understand about religious freedom in the American founding is that it wasn't designed to weaken or to downplay religion. It was designed to protect it. So we can see that clearly in the documents that you referred to, or in like the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And I live just nearby the University of Virginia here, and the idea was very simple. Faith does not need the support of government to exist or even to survive. Religion thrives best when it's free, when it grows through conviction, not coercion, within the boundaries of practice.
You know, Vilo, sometimes I think part of the problem is we don't see enough training even in academia on these points. It's like we live a life where there is an assumption that we all understand how the First Amendment came into play, and as a result thereof, people pick and choose the part they like, and they start fighting about the points thinking we're fighting about something new, but no, they already fought, 250 years ago, and this is exactly how it's supposed to be. But, you know, I know you've even talked about training that you've had in this area and even seen in the classrooms from time to time.
You know, if we forget the lessons of history, we're doomed to repeat them. And, you know, I think back to Patrick Henry, who was trying to get a bill through the Virginia legislature to require the legislature to pay pastors of Christian churches. Basically, it would be the Anglican or Episcopal Church. And then you have the Baptists who were unlicensed, who were persecuted terrifically. And so they got after Madison, and Madison, of course, wrote his famous memorial and remonstrance. And once he was through with that, that brought about the end of Patrick Henry's bill. And that defeat led to Thomas Jefferson's statute for religious freedom in Virginia. And it was a great move forward, because it was interesting at the beginning. You have Madison and Jefferson opposing all establishment, federal or state. You have Washington, who's fine with state as long as there's no federal. And so it's interesting, you know, how Madison began. He's reported to have written the first phrases there of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. Congress can't say anything about federal establishment. Congress can't say anything about state establishments either.
You know, I think there's something that's very important to understand about that too, is that when the country was first founded, they came together under Articles of Confederation. They were 13 separate sovereign states with no powerful national government. So that's why, Pennsylvania considered a Catholic state. Maryland considered a Catholic state. Your Calvinists were further north in New England and whatnot. They were operating as separate entities, and it wasn't until Shays' Rebellion that they came to understand, no, we got to rewrite these Articles of Confederation. We've got to come up with a constitution because we got to function as a nation as opposed to an agreement amongst 13 sovereign entities.
Mm-hmm. And that's why they moved away from tax-supported churches and religious tests for public office, because that was also a part of the discussions at the time, taking religious tests in order for you to be in public office. So they created a system where a belief would be always voluntary, where churches would stand on persuasion and not on privilege. And historically, that approach worked. It has worked thus far. Religious participation actually increased in the decades that followed. So the principle that emerges is not exclusion, but separation for the sake of integrity. Government does not need to promote religion for religion to flourish, and religion does not need government power to remain relevant and influential.
I think that's an absolutely excellent point, right? So whenever we talk about this, usually like religious or quote unquote Christian foundations of America, right? At the founding of the Republic, our best numbers say that 17% of Americans went to a religious service once a month. That's just the reality of the colonies. Once we established disestablishment, right? Historians, book science talk about this, of the religious marketplace. Why is America so religious compared to, say, Europe? Right? Well, the answer seems to be because the government stayed out of it. And in America, if you have different beliefs and different ideas, right? I live in the South. You can go to one church and you walk out of that church and across the street is another church of the same denomination, because 50 years ago, someone said, you're not preaching the gospel the way I like. I'm going to go start my own right church. And they usually do it somewhere very nearby, right? And take as many as you can. That's the religious vitality of America, is the government's not telling you what you can and cannot do. So this idea of the government should protect religion, historically, that's nonsense. When the government stays out of it is when religion really flourishes in America, and is what we've seen throughout the world.
Vilo, it seems like we're trying to see more of a creation of a confederation of states, as opposed to the United States of America. And there's almost a battle to go back to remember what the framers were doing, to understand states' rights are important, but not important in such a way that it excludes everything else we're trying to do federally. I mean, what's your thoughts on that, Vilo?
Yeah, it's interesting, this establishment movement that took a while to disestablish in the churches. And you get down to about the 1840s, and Massachusetts was probably the last state with an established church. So it took a while to get rid of that vestige, and because faith has been robust in our country.
Well, I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think faith being robust in a country and supported in a way where government stays out of it seems to be the best way to allow religious freedom to flourish. Coming up, a California policy allows schools to hide crucial information from parents regarding their child's mental health. Stick around, we'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity, with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case that's called Marabelli versus Bonta, in which California requires its public school to hide children's expressed transgender status at school from their parents and to facilitate those children's transitions regardless of their parents' religious beliefs. Religious parents and teachers challenged this policy after families learned they were being kept in the dark. In one family's case, the parents discovered that their public school had been doing behind their backs only after their daughter attempted suicide. The Supreme Court blocked California's policy and protected parents' rights to know what is happening with their children at school in its per curiam opinion released earlier this year. The state argues that its policies advance a compelling interest in student safety and privacy, but those policies cut out the primary protectors of children's best interests, which should be their parents. You know, Milka, this seems to be a very interesting concept here. How do we balance the privacy of children with ensuring that the individuals who in many instances are their primary caretakers, their guardians, or their parents should have a voice in what's going on? California seems to be having a battle that's taking place here. The Supreme Court is coming in and trying to weigh in to see how do we clarify this, but how do we kind of juxtapose trying to make sure we're protecting children, using those phrases like in the best interest of children, but also ensuring that parents are involved in some form or fashion as well? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this case really highlights an ongoing, it's not a new debate. Where do you draw the line, right? In state and school intervention and the family's responsibility, but it's becoming increasingly very sensitive as we see cultural shifts in morality in our context here. But the debate of who has the primary responsibility for a child's well-being, would it be the state or the parents? And that should be a simple answer, no longer. One family only discovered what had been, as you mentioned, what had been happening to their kid after their daughter attempted suicide. That kind of situation, extreme situation, it's not about an abstract legal concept and just managing risks anymore. It's really about human dignity and responsibility. The state's position is that these policies are meant to protect students, to ensure safety and privacy, especially in situations where a child may feel vulnerable. And no one would disagree with the general principle that schools do have a responsibility to care for students. When I leave my kids at school, I really hope so. I really hope they will take care of the kids while they're under the school supervision. But the difficulty arises when that responsibility starts to replace rather than support the role of the parents. Because parents are not fringe figures in a child's life. They are the primary guardians. They're legally, both legally and practically. So when a system begins to exclude them from major decisions about their child's identity and well-being, it raises deep questions about where that boundary should be drawn. And that's why the Supreme Court intervention is so significant. By blocking the policy, the court indicated that whatever interest the state may have, they cannot come at the complete expense of parental involvement and awareness.
No, Vilo, when we see where we're going with this, you know, this whole balancing the rights of individuals who are students. I remember the first time, I heard that I couldn't get my son's grades because, he was quote unquote an adult and he was independent. I thought to myself, I'm paying his tuition. What are they talking about here? But it seems like this balance seems to be even confusing even below they become adults. You're coming into elementary schools and middle schools and all these rights. I mean, how are we going to deal with this as a society?
It's crazy because they're giving rights to kids that are minors, and they couldn't go out and buy a car at the car lot and sign a contract, but yet they're giving kids to do this. And, I think California has forgotten Yoder because, in Yoder, the Supreme Court ruled that the parents' free exercise rights outweigh the state's interest in forcing children to attend until age 16. And, we have an educational bureaucracy that wants to run with their own agenda and doesn't want to be accountable to anyone, and that's very worrisome. So I'm grateful for the Supreme Court's intervention in the Mirabella v. Bonta case.
Wilma, I can't figure out when you're a parent now and when you're not. The idea that my 12-year-old has some thoughts that maybe should supersede mine. I mean, the horror of just those words coming out of my mouth, right? Frightening in and of itself. But in the same breath, what happens when you have a parent that may be overly aggressive in a certain direction is the opportunity that, well, but they're still the parent, so they get to make that call? Or should the state be trying to figure out how we handling the best interest of a child, but not to the exclusion of a parent? Or is that even possible?
I wish my son could hear this conversation, but there goes my crazy father. But here we're talking about a child's identity. So we also then are talking about medical issues, whether that be mental health, whether that be physical health. Mm-hmm. And those issues are some of the most important issues as it relates to the relationship between parent and child. And so for the school to think that a child's identity issues or a child's decision to change their identity should be kept from the parent, I don't think anything could be more wrong than that. When children act out in public, there are many calls for, now what are you going to do? Well, you got to hold the parents accountable for the actions of their children. So this is definitely a bridge too far, because we don't know whether or not that child's decision is a temporary decision, whether that, there are so many parameters here. And the final question I have to ask is, what's going on in the home where the child doesn't feel comfortable enough approaching the parent to say, this is where I am? Because my wife and I have always told our son, we don't care what you do. This is the place to come for the solution.
No, Andrew, the best interest of the child concept, it seems to be one that no one understands anymore. You know, you want to protect the child, but can't figure out how to do it for some reason.
That's right. I mean, part of this, I think, is wrapped up in the national, quote unquote, discussion of transgenderism. It seems that no one can have just compassion and just common sense with a lot of this, right? I do think that mixes it up. I think that the great difficulty of this is there is no parallel to anything like this involving children, right? It is not just, well, the parents are acting in a way that the state thinks is detrimental to the parents, and therefore we step in. We have those in many instances. There is not another parallel in which we will not inform the parents. I mean, I've worked for a decade in an advocate for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, right? Involving children in many cases. It's incredibly complicated. Not every parent is what we would call a good, caring parent. All of that stuff can come. The idea that the state says, we will not tell you, right? In every other circumstances, including direct abuse, we will protect you, child, from a parent who's abusing you, but they have to be informed. There's nothing else that is an equivalent of this in American culture. So this is my great difficulty of the entire thing. When the state says, no, parents don't get to know, I just can't understand a justification. We may need steps in between that. We have to protect children from their own parents. That happens. The idea of we won't inform you, there's nothing else involved. Children are adults somehow in only this one situation, and therefore parents shouldn't be involved. I just can't understand a justification for this, even when your point is protecting children. There's so many other better ways to do this.
And again, of course, we could agree that children should be and must be protected, period. Schools should be supportive environments, but that support should not come at the expense of removing the parents from the picture.
Yeah.
Because in the long run, the most stable and healthy outcomes tend to still come when institutions and families are working together, not when they are placed in tension with one another and cutting communication.
And to that point, under the pretext of protecting the child, what are you protecting? And why are you protecting it? I think that needs to be, to follow up to the previous point, I think that needs to be added. In the best interest of the child, well, according to who and what are you protecting?
Yeah, yeah. You know, Vilo, what's interesting is, so a state will come in and say, well, it's a compelling state interest, right? There's something so compelling about what we're putting forward here. And then you start using terms like public safety and safety of the community. Are we finding states that are trying to really push too much underneath this banner of compelling state interest? And that may be causing some of our issues here.
No, I think there are usurping powers that they don't have, because again, you have Yoder, you have Society of Sisters, where the Supreme Court found that parents have the right to direct and prepare their children for additional obligations, and so, you know, it's a new way of thinking, and it just it boggles my mind that the states think they can run unilaterally roughshod over mom and dad.
I think the best interest of the children, still, you have a primary caregiver, which is your parents. And the idea of kind of creating an environment where somehow they get cut out of the process in the name of privacy seems to be something that now is creating what I would call a bridge too far. I think the realities of what we're seeing here is we've got California, we have other states. They're trying to figure out, how do we impose our power, our will, our outcomes to get what we're looking for. But at the end of the day, looking out for the best interests of the children and making sure that parents are involved to some degree. If they're bad parents, we'll deal with that, but parents should be involved nonetheless. Hey, Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, persecuted in the Old World, became persecutors in the New World, executing 4 Quakers simply because they were Quakers.
Wow. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Well, we talked today about the founding fathers and Alexander Hamilton, right? Most of us know that he died in that fateful duel with Aaron Burr. But Orland, did you know that his son Philip died 3 years previous in the exact same location, also by a duel? A local newspaper editor had said some terrible things about his father. They went to the duel, and like his father, he threw his shot away, and yet he himself was shot and died soon after.
Oh, wow. Milcar, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orland, did you know that honey never spoils? And that was actually demonstrated as jars of honey found in ancient Egyptian tombs with over 3,000 years old. They are still perfectly edible. It's one of the only foods that literally doesn't expire. And I'm curious to know as well, who was the person who tried that honey?
Oh, honey never expires. Can't wait to tell my wife that. Hey, Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, the first thing is, you can use the honey, but you better check the bread, because it's probably moldy and stale. But with that being said, Orland, did you know that identical twins do not have the same fingerprints? And the reason is because of environmental factors and issues that happen in the womb. So you can't blame your crimes on your twin.
Wow. Great having you guys here with us. Loved our conversation. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.